The morning mist clung to the Oregon mountains like ghostly fingers, as four orphaned boys made their way up the treacherous path toward Jeremiah Whitlock's isolated cabin. They'd been traveling for 3 weeks through some of the most unforgiving wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, following rumors and whispered stories that had led them to this remote valley. The oldest boy, 15-year-old Nathan Cross, clutched a rolled piece of parchment against his chest as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Behind him struggled his 3 companions, Marcus, 13, whose dark eyes held determination that seemed far too mature for his age, Luke, 11, whose red hair caught the filtered sunlight like flame, and little Jacob, barely 9, who'd proven to be the toughest of them all despite his small stature. "You sure this is the right place?" Marcus asked, his breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. Nathan consulted the crude directions they'd been given by a trapper in Portland. Old Prospector said Whitlock's cabin was in the valley where Eagle Creek meets the Salmon River. This has to be it. The cabin, when it finally came into view, looked like something from a fairy tale written by someone with dark imagination. Built from massive logs and nestled against a sheer rock face, it seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the boys could see a figure moving behind windows that gleamed like suspicious eyes. In the morning light, "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Luke whispered, his freckled face pale with apprehension. "People say Jeremiah Whitlock shoots strangers on sight." "People say a lot of things," Nathan replied, though his own voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "They also say he's the only person alive who remembers the old settlements from before the Indian Wars." Jacob, the youngest, stepped forward with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "Let's just ask him. What's the worst that could happen?" Before anyone could answer that ominous question, the cabin door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire valley. The man who emerged was unlike anything the boys had expected. Jeremiah Whitlock was tall and gaunt, with wild gray hair and a beard that reached nearly to his waist. His clothes were rough homespun, patched and repatched over years of mountain living. But it was his eyes that truly captured attention, pale blue orbs that seemed to see too much and remember things better left forgotten. "Boys," Whitlock said, his voice carrying the scratchy quality of someone who rarely spoke to other humans. "You're either very brave or very stupid to come up here alone. Maybe both, sir." Nathan replied honestly, "But we need your help." Whitlock studied the 4 young faces with the intensity of a hawk evaluating potential prey. "Help with what? And don't tell me you're lost, because nobody finds this cabin by accident." Nathan unrolled the parchment he'd been carrying and held it up for Whitlock to see. "We found this map in the ruins of the Cascade City orphanage after it burned down. It shows the location of a settlement called Haven Valley, established in 1852. We think our families might have lived there." The change in Whitlock's expression was immediate and dramatic. The suspicious wariness disappeared, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with deep, old pain. "Where did you say you found that map?" he asked, his voice suddenly quiet. "In a lockbox hidden behind the orphanage kitchen," Marcus explained. "The matron, Mrs. Henderson, told us before she died that some of the children who came to the orphanage had parents from settlements that disappeared during the Indian conflicts. She said if we ever wanted to know where we came from, we should look for the records she kept hidden." Whitlock moved closer, his pale eyes fixed on the map with an intensity that made the boys step back instinctively. "Haven Valley," he whispered, more to himself than to them. "I thought every trace of that place had been lost. You know about it?" Luke asked eagerly. Whitlock was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map as if it showed the location of his own grave. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of guilt and regret. "Know about it," he said slowly. "Boys, I was the one who led the families to Haven Valley in the first place, and I was the only one who survived when it fell." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "What happened there?" Nathan asked quietly. Whitlock looked at the 4 young faces, seeing in them echoes of other children he'd known long ago. Children who'd never grown up, never had the chance to ask questions about their heritage or seek the truth about their past. "Come inside," he said finally. "What I have to tell you isn't a story for the open air." The interior of Whitlock's cabin was a museum of frontier life, filled with tools, weapons, and artifacts from a bygone era. But what caught the boys' attention were the photographs, dozens of them, showing families and children from what appeared to be a thriving settlement, Haven Valley. Whitlock said, noticing their interest, 43 families, 216 people. "We thought we'd found paradise in that hidden valley, protected by mountains on all sides, with fresh water and rich soil for farming." He pointed to one photograph showing a group of children playing near a wooden schoolhouse. "Some of those children might have been your parents or older siblings. The settlement lasted 3 years before." His voice trailed off, and the boys waited patiently for him to continue. "Before I led them all to their deaths," he finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier adventures. You won't believe the tragic secret this hermit has been carrying for 40 years, Jacob." The youngest approached one of the photographs with wide eyes. "This girl," he said, pointing to a child who appeared to be about his own age. "She looks just like my sister Emma did before she died." Whitlock moved to see which photograph Jacob was indicating, and his face went completely white. "That's Sarah Cross," he said in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "She was 9 years old when the settlement was attacked." Nathan felt his knees go weak. "Cross? But that's my name, Nathan Cross, and mine," Marcus added, his voice barely audible. Whitlock stared at the boys with growing amazement and horror. "Dear God," he whispered, "you're not just looking for information about Haven Valley. You're looking for your family." Luke pointed to another photograph. "This man, with the red hair. Could that be Thomas Murphy?" Whitlock confirmed. He was the settlement's blacksmith, had 3 children, Luke, Mary, and little Daniel, Luke Murphy. The red-headed boy said, his voice filled with wonder and sadness, "That's my full name." The final revelation came when Jacob pointed to a photograph of a young couple standing beside a small log house. "James and Rebecca Brooks," Whitlock said, his voice thick with emotion. "They had 2 boys, Jacob and Samuel. Samuel was just a baby when." He couldn't finish the sentence, but the boys understood. They weren't just random orphans who'd stumbled across a forgotten map. They were the children and grandchildren of Haven Valley, the sole survivors of a tragedy that had haunted one man for decades. "What happened to the settlement?" Nathan asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Whitlock walked to the window and stared out at the mountains that had been both sanctuary and prison. "For most of his adult life, I was supposed to protect them," he said quietly. "I was the guide, the one who knew the territory and the dangers, but I got overconfident, made decisions that put everyone at risk." He turned back to face the 4 boys who represented both his greatest failure and his only chance at redemption. "If you really want to know what happened to Haven Valley, if you really want to understand where you came from, then you need to see it for yourselves. But I have to warn you, some truths are too heavy for young shoulders to carry." As the Oregon mist swirled around the isolated cabin, 5 people stood surrounded by photographs of the dead and faced with a decision that would change all their lives. The map had led them to more than just information about a lost settlement. It had led them to the man who carried the weight of their family's destruction, and who might be their only guide to understanding the past that had shaped their present. The truth about Haven Valley was waiting in that hidden mountain valley, but getting there would require trusting the one man who blamed himself for the tragedy that had made them all orphans. At dawn the next morning, Jeremiah Whitlock emerged from his cabin carrying a pack that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The 4 boys were already awake, huddled around a small fire and sharing the last of their meager supplies. "The trail to Haven Valley hasn't been used in 40 years, Whitlock said without preamble. "It'll take us 3 days through country that wants to kill you in a dozen different ways. Last chance to change your minds." Nathan looked at his 3 companions and saw his own determination reflected in their young faces. "We've come this far. We're not turning back now." "Then listen carefully," Whitlock continued. his voice taking on the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating wilderness dangers. "We follow my lead exactly. No questions. No arguments. The mountains this far into the Cascades don't forgive mistakes." The first day's travel took them along deer paths and creek beds that seemed to exist only in Whitlock's memory. The hermit moved through the forest like a ghost, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed stones that were invisible to the boys. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly wild and forbidding. Ancient trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew thin and cold, and more than once the boys had to rest to catch their breath. "Tell us about the settlement," Marcus asked during one of their breaks. "What was it like when people actually lived there?" Whitlock was quiet for so long that the boys thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and loss. "It was everything we dreamed it would be," he said softly. "Hidden valley, maybe 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, surrounded by peaks that made it invisible from the main trails, fresh water from mountain springs, soil so rich you could grow anything. We thought we'd found the promised land." "Why did you leave civilization to start a new settlement?" Luke asked. "Same reason most folks went west in those days," Whitlock replied. "We wanted a chance to build something of our own, away from the corruption and violence of the cities. Your families, they were good people who believed in hard work and taking care of each other." Jacob, the youngest, had been walking quietly beside Whitlock for most of the morning. Now he spoke up with the directness that only children possess. "If it was so perfect, what went wrong?" Whitlock stopped walking and turned to look at the 4 boys, who were carrying the genetic legacy of people he'd failed to protect for decades earlier. "Pride," he said simply. "My pride, specifically. I convinced everyone that we were safe in that valley, that the mountains would protect us from the Indian conflicts that were raging throughout the territory. I was wrong." The second day brought them to terrain that seemed untouched by human presence. They followed ridge lines and crossed mountain streams on fallen logs, always climbing higher into country that felt increasingly alien and threatening. "The Cascade Wars," Whitlock continued as they walked, "were different from the Indian conflicts in other parts of the country. The tribes here weren't trying to drive out all white settlers. They were trying to protect specific sacred sites that the government and miners were destroying." "Sacred sites?" Nathan asked. "Places their ancestors had used for religious ceremonies for thousands of years. Spring gathering grounds, burial sites, vision quest locations." The problem was, nobody bothered to ask the tribes which places were sacred before they started building settlements and mining claims. Marcus began to understand where the story was heading. Haven Valley was built on sacred ground, the most sacred ground in the entire region, Whitlock confirmed. A place the local tribes called where the spirits dance. They'd been holding ceremonies there since before recorded history. "But you didn't know that when you led the families there?" Luke asked. Whitlock's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. "Oh, I knew. The tribal leaders tried to warn me, tried to explain the significance of the valley. But I was young and arrogant and convinced that white settlers had more right to the land than superstitious savages. Subscribe to our channel now. The heartbreaking truth about what happened to Haven Valley will leave you speechless." The third day of travel brought them to a high mountain pass where the air was so thin that every step required conscious effort. As they crested the ridge, Whitlock stopped and pointed toward a distant valley barely visible through morning mist. "Haven Valley," he said quietly. 40 years since I've seen it." Even from miles away, the boys could see that the valley was different from the surrounding wilderness. The vegetation was lusher, the landscape more gentle and welcoming. It looked like the kind of place where people might choose to build a new life. "It's beautiful," Jacob said with wonder. It was. Whitlock agreed. "Your family's built 43 homes down there, along with a schoolhouse, a church, and a trading post. For 3 years, it was the closest thing to paradise any of us had ever seen." "What happened on the day it ended?" Nathan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Whitlock began the final descent toward the valley, his movements mechanical and his voice hollow with remembered pain. April 15, 1855. I was leading a hunting party in the high country when we saw the smoke. By the time we got back to the valley, it was over. Every building burned. Every person dead or missing. All of them, Marcus asked. 116 people, Whitlock confirmed. Men, women, children. The tribal warriors had given them a chance to leave peacefully, but the settlement leaders refused. They said they had legal claim to the land and wouldn't be driven out by threats from savages. Luke was beginning to understand the full scope of the tragedy, so the tribe attacked. They defended their sacred ground, Whitlock corrected, just like any of us would have done if strangers built a town in our family cemetery. As they approached the valley floor, the boys began to see evidence of the settlement that had once thrived there. Stone foundations, marked warehouses had stood. The remains of a wooden bridge crossed a creek that ran clear and cold through the center of the valley. Most poignantly, they could see the outline of what had once been the schoolhouse. Now nothing more than a rectangle of stones and charred wood. "This is where your families lived," Whitlock said, his voice barely audible. "This is where you would have grown up if I hadn't led them to their deaths." The boys spread out through the ruins, each drawn to different remnants of the lost community. Nathan found the remains of a house that matched the one in the photograph where his family had posed. Marcus discovered farming tools buried under decades of fallen leaves. Luke located the blacksmith shop where his father had worked. Jacob found a small wooden toy horse, carved with the kind of love that only a parent puts into a gift for their child. But it was the cemetery that affected them most profoundly. 43 wooden markers, weathered but still readable, stood in neat rows on a hillside overlooking the valley. Each marker bore a name, dates, and often a simple inscription that spoke to the dreams and hopes that had died with Haven Valley. Thomas and Margaret Cross, Nathan read from one marker. Parents of Nathan, Marcus and Sarah. James and Rebecca Brooks, Jacob whispered, kneeling beside another grave. Beloved parents of Jacob and Samuel. Sean and Mary Murphy, Luke said, his voice thick with emotion. He forged tools for the future. As the sun set over the hidden valley, 5 people stood among the graves of a lost community and felt the full weight of history, tragedy, and the cruel randomness of survival. "How did we survive?" Marcus asked. "If everyone was killed, how are we here?" Whitlock knelt beside a small grave marked Sarah Cross, age 9, taken too soon, and placed a wild flower on the weathered wood. "Because," he said quietly, "some of you weren't here when it happened, and because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to make sure their story survives." The truth about their survival was still to come, but already the boys understood that they weren't just orphans anymore. They were the living legacy of Haven Valley, and their presence in this lost place had awakened something in Jeremiah Whitlock that had been sleeping for 40 years, the possibility of redemption. As dawn broke over Haven Valley, Jeremiah Whitlock sat beside the cold ashes of their campfire and began the hardest story he'd ever had to tell. The 4 boys gathered around him, their young faces solemn with the weight of what they'd discovered. In the ruins of their ancestral home, the attack happened in the early morning, Whitlock began, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. The tribal warriors came down from the high country like ghosts, giving the settlement one final chance to leave peacefully. But they refused, Nathan said. It wasn't a question. The settlement council voted to fight. Whitlock confirmed. They said they'd rather die than abandon the homes they'd built. In the end, they got their wish. Marcus looked toward the cemetery where their families lay buried. But we weren't here. How is that possible if this was our home? Whitlock stood and walked to the creek that ran through the center of the valley. Because 3 months before the attack, I convinced 12 families to let me take their youngest children to Portland for supplies and to arrange for a teacher for the school. You boys were part of that group. You saved us, Luke said with wonder. I saved some of you. Whitlock corrected, his voice heavy with survivor's guilt. 15 children made that trip to Portland. By the time we got back to find the settlement destroyed, disease and accidents had claimed 11 of them. Only you 4 survived long enough to make it to the Cascade City orphanage. Jacob, the youngest, was trying to understand the scope of what he was hearing. So we're the only ones left from the whole settlement. The only ones who carry the blood of Haven Valley, Whitlock confirmed. For 40 years, I've carried the guilt of surviving when everyone else died. But now I understand why I lived when they didn't. Why? Nathan asked. Whitlock turned to face the four boys, who represented both his greatest failure and his unexpected chance at redemption, to make sure their story was told, to make sure Haven Valley wasn't forgotten, and to help the last children of the settlement understand where they came from and who they really are. Over the next 3 days, Whitlock led them through every corner of the hidden valley, sharing memories and stories that brought the lost community back to life. He showed them where their fathers had worked, where their mothers had tended gardens, where they themselves had taken their first steps and spoken their first words. Your father, Nathan, was the settlement's leader, Whitlock said as they stood beside the foundation of what had once been the largest house in the valley. Thomas Cross was the one who convinced everyone to come west, and he was the one who made the final decision to fight rather than flee. Was he wrong? Nathan asked. Whitlock considered the question carefully. He was brave. Whether he was right or wrong, that's not for me to judge. He died defending his family's home, which is what any good man would do. Tell us about our father, Marcus said, standing beside Nathan. Thomas Cross was the kind of man who could see potential where others saw only wilderness. Whitlock replied. He looked at this valley and saw not just good farmland, but a place where children could grow up free from the violence and corruption of the cities. He died trying to build a better world for his sons. As they explored the ruins, each boy began to understand not just where he'd come from, but who he was meant to become. Nathan discovered that he'd inherited his father's natural leadership abilities. Marcus found that his aptitude for reading the land came from generations of farmers. Luke learned that his intuitive understanding of how things worked was a gift from his blacksmith father. Jacob realized that his ability to see the good in people was his mother's legacy. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of family, legacy, and second chances. You won't believe how this emotional journey ends, but the most important discovery came on their final day in the valley, when Whitlock led them to a cave hidden behind a waterfall near the cemetery. The tribal elders told me about this place, he said as they entered the natural chamber. They said it was where the spirits of the dead came to speak to the living. Inside the cave, they found something that took their breath away. Dozens of personal items that had been carefully preserved by the tribal people who'd destroyed the settlement. Photographs, letters, children's toys, and family heirlooms, all arranged with reverence and care. They saved these, Luke asked in amazement. The warriors who attacked Haven Valley weren't monsters, Whitlock explained. They were people defending their most sacred place. But they were also human beings who understood that families had lived here, that children had been loved here. After the battle, they gathered everything personal they could find and brought it to this cave. Nathan picked up a photograph of his parents and siblings, amazed to find it perfectly preserved after 4 decades. There's something else, Whitlock said quietly. He led them to the back of the cave, where a wooden chest sat beneath a carefully arranged collection of stones. Inside the chest were documents that changed everything: birth certificates, family records, and most importantly, legal papers establishing the children's right to inherit their family's property in the Oregon Territory. Your families weren't just settlers, Whitlock revealed. Several of them, including the Cross and Murphy families, held legitimate land claims throughout the territory, claims that would pass to their surviving children. Marcus stared at the legal documents with growing amazement. We're not just orphans, we're landowners. More than that, Whitlock continued. You're the rightful heirs to one of the most successful mining claims in Oregon. Your grandfather, Patrick Cross, filed a claim on a gold mine near Jacksonville 3 months before he died in Haven Valley. That claim has been generating royalties for 40 years, held in trust by the territorial government. The boys looked at each other in shock. They'd come seeking information about their past and found a future they'd never imagined possible. What do we do now? Jacob asked. Whitlock smiled for the first time since they'd known him. Now we go back to civilization and claim what's rightfully yours. And then, he paused, looking around the ruins of the settlement. Then we decide what to do with Haven Valley. 6 months later, The four boys stood once again in the hidden valley, but this time they weren't alone. With them were territorial, surveyors, government officials, and representatives of the tribal council that had defended this land for decades earlier. The agreement they'd negotiated was unprecedented in the history of the Oregon Territory. The boys would retain ownership of their families' land claims throughout the territory, but Haven Valley itself would be returned to the tribal people who considered it sacred ground. In exchange, the tribe would help establish the Haven Valley Memorial School, a place where children of all backgrounds could learn about the shared history of the Pacific Northwest and the importance of understanding between different cultures. "It's what our parents would have wanted," Nathan said as they signed the agreement that transformed a place of tragedy into a symbol of hope and reconciliation. Jeremiah Whitlock, no longer a hermit, but the school's first headmaster, watched the ceremony with tears in his eyes. For 40 years, he'd carried the guilt of surviving when others died. Now he understood that his survival had a purpose: to ensure that the children of Haven Valley could reclaim their heritage and transform their family's tragedy into something positive. For future generations, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of family, redemption, and the power of understanding our past. Hit that subscribe button now, because these tales of courage and reconciliation will restore your faith in human nature. As the sun set over the valley where their families had once lived and died, for young men who'd started as orphans stood as the inheritors of both wealth and wisdom. They'd found more than just their family history in the ruins of Haven Valley. They'd found their purpose: to make sure that the dreams their parents died defending would finally come true. The lost settlement had been found, not as a place on a map, but as a living legacy carried forward by the children who'd survived to tell its story. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of family heritage and frontier reconciliation to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing adventures that prove love and understanding can heal even the deepest wounds.